the country on, and I'm really excited to see everyone. Just in terms of the agenda and what you can expect, we're going to be spending the first 15 to 20 minutes just sort of filling you in on this very specific niche of immigration and skills. What's happening on the Hill, and like especially in light of the pandemic and the protests and everything like that. I mean, like, where does immigration and skills fit into the larger picture in terms of Capitol Hill? Smack in the center of the event, we're going to be having mass action. So it's going to be a Twitter, and then like a tweet storm type thing, and then also we're going to give you information so you can reach out to your members of Congress. And then the last portion of it is going to be, like I said, Q&A. And feel free to use the chat box throughout the entire session to let us know anything and everything that you think might be useful for us as we advocate on the Hill. Again, it's really nice to see everyone. My name is Jessica Cardot. I'm the National Network Manager here at National Skills Coalition. And we sort of developed this forum as an opportunity to keep our field engaged as things move quickly on Capitol Hill in the midst of a national pandemic and crisis, and to hear from you about what's happening on the ground. So most of you already know her, but I'm going to introduce my esteemed colleague, Senior Fellow Amanda Berkson-Shilcock, and she's going to sort of lead us through the policy portion. Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much, Jessica. Thanks so much, Jessica, and thanks to all of you for making the time to be here during this really tumultuous period in most of our lives. We did want to just start off by asking you to type some thoughts into the chat box. And in particular, we'd love to ask you to identify a policy barrier that is challenging your ability to serve immigrant students or job seekers in this moment. Now, I know that not all of you work in direct service organizations, so feel free to interpret this question as liberally as you'd like to. But keeping in mind that the focus of our conversation today is on education and workforce generally. So again, we'd love to hear what's a policy barrier, could be large, could be small, could be federal, could be local, that's complicating your ability to provide services to immigrants in this moment. I'm going to give you a minute to type your answers into the chat. Okay. So while folks are doing that, I just want to thank you all for joining us and to acknowledge a couple of things. First of all, we've very carefully structured this, as Jessica said, so that it is enough of a conversation. That is, we aren't going to be talking at you for an hour. We want to share some updates on Capitol Hill, but we definitely want to hear from you as well, and we've built in several different ways for that to happen. We're also really delighted that we have been collaborating in this event with some of our close partners at the national level, and I'll introduce them in just a moment. I just want to start with one big picture acknowledgement. Most of us who work on immigration have to work on a huge variety of issues: public safety, public health, language access, on and on and on. This event and National Skills Coalition work more broadly are really meant to carve out time for immigration advocates to think about the education and workforce component of their work. And we do mean education in the sense as including both adult education, English language classes, high school equivalency classes, adult basic education classes, but also higher education, post-secondary education, community colleges, technical colleges, even four-year universities in some cases, and the public workforce system, right? The ability of immigrants to get access to job training, to get help finding a job if they've lost a job, to pursue occupational licensing. So that's kind of the focus of our conversation today. And some of you who've seen me do presentations before know that I often like to have my slide of a forest fire and my slide of a person planting a seedling, right? But sometimes when it feels like the forest is burning down and we're all just worried about making sure that we deal with a fire that's raging in front of us, it can be hard to think about longer term policy change. But it is important to keep planting the seeds for that policy change so that when the fire is over, there is an opportunity for those new shoots to start to spring up. So I appreciate that you have carved out time in your day to do that today. And we are going to be respectful of your time and try to make the best possible use of it. So I'm really pleased that National Skills Coalition is partnering with two absolutely outstanding organizations. Many of you know the National Immigration Forum. We are privileged to have Dan Costin from the forum here with us today. They have been a longtime partner with us in co-convening a working group on immigration and federal skills policy in DC this past 4 years, and have really led some important work, not just through their Bibles, Badges, and Business initiative, which many of you may be familiar with, and their advocacy as a center-right immigration organization, but also through their New American Workforce program, which is a really innovative model for English language learning for immigrant workers. Also partnering with us on today's event is World Education Services, including their Global Talent Bridge program and their Imprint program for immigrant professionals. WES is a 40-year-old nonprofit that provides credential evaluation services and has branched out in the past 5 years to really provide a wide range of support to immigrant advocates at the state and local level. We are just delighted to have not only Jackie Esposito, who you're going to hear from in a moment, but also Stacy Simon and other WES staff with us on the call today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over now to Dan to give a quick introduction, and then Dan will turn things over to Jackie. Oh, Dan, I think you're still muted.
Thank you, Amanda. My name is Dan Costin, and I am the Assistant Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at the National Immigration Forum. And part of my portfolio is covering the intersection of immigrants and skills and workforce development. And I'm pleased to have the opportunity to engage a little later on in the program today. Let me turn it over to Jackie.
Thanks so much, Dan, and thank you, Amanda, and everyone at the National Skills Coalition for having us be part of this really important conversation today. As Amanda said, I am with World Education Services, or WES, as some of you may know. I am their new U.S. Policy and Advocacy Director. I am also the director of the Imprint Coalition. WES, as Amanda says, is a nonprofit, a social enterprise nonprofit based in the US and Canada. We provide credential evaluation services to immigrants, refugees, and international students. And as part of that work, we advocate to remove barriers both to employment as well as to education for immigrants, refugees, and international students here and also in Canada. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. And I'm handing it over to Katie Spiker.
Thanks, Jackie. My name is Katie Spiker. I'm National Skills Coalition's Director of Government Affairs, and I will share a little bit about a general Hill update from what we've seen both in the past couple of months from opportunities for funding and policy change in workforce and education generally. And then I'll turn it back to Amanda to add a little bit more context around some of the provisions that have specifically focused on immigrant workers. So overall, I will start with the negative and then turn to the opportunity. So the negative from what we've seen out of early stimulus packages is that workforce has not been a huge focus of some of those negotiations. In large part, this has been because CARES Act, which folks will remember from earlier this year, which passed both House and Senate and is where some of the funding from earlier stimulus packages have come from, was really framed as a response to the current health and economic crisis. And workforce was not seen as from members of Congress as being part of necessary funding and big priority for that initial response package. The opportunity right now that we're looking at, however, is that as and I'll talk a little bit more about the timeline we expect for future stimulus packages, but the summary of what I'll get through is that we don't expect anything out in the next couple of weeks, which means we do have an opportunity as advocates to ensure that workforce and education programs that serve immigrant workers are part of the next stimulus package. So what can we expect looking forward? So people remember that Congress passed the CARES Act. CARES Act included $375 million in federal funding for dislocated workers that went out through national grant programs, largely to states, and is really a drop in the bucket compared to obviously what the need folks on the phone are facing and workers across the country. There was also $30 billion of state education stabilization funding that could be used for adult education and career and technical education. But I'm sure I can already tell from some of the comments that folks have not been able to tap into the kind of resources that are necessary to serve your networks, in large part because there wasn't a carve out of required use of funding for some of these education and training programs. As I said, CARES Act was largely billed and talked about as a response to the current crisis. And following CARES Act, House Democrats on the Ed and Labor Committee introduced a bill called the Relaunching America's Workforce Act that included $15 billion funding for workforce and education programs. People may be familiar with the Act, which the House Democrats passed last month. It was a $3 trillion bill intended to build on CARES Act. And that included, from the $15 billion authorizing committee, only $2.75 billion in workforce and education funding. It did include a re-up of the $30 billion of funding that would go to states as education stabilization funding. But again, without a required set aside of those dollars to either career and technical education or adult education, still just allowable uses of those funds. So the House passed their, House Dems largely passed their HEROES Act. The Senate is not anticipated to take up the HEROES Act as a template for the next stage of a stimulus negotiations. It in large part was House Democrats responding to and putting forward their own priorities. But they, and Senate Republicans in general, have been unwilling to start formal negotiations around a next stimulus package. That said, informal conversations are happening. There seems to be general agreement that there needs to be additional funding, whether it's for states and local areas and for other priorities under a future stimulus package. So we'll likely see those formal negotiations ramp up following the 4th of July. There were early reports that we may see a next stimulus package as early as the 4th, but right now it looks like those negotiations are really going to ramp up after the holiday. And will probably look a lot like what the previous negotiations did, where things are negotiated by leadership. And then we see draft text at the last minute. The opportunity here, even though there is a smaller group of offices that are actually involved in those negotiations, is that there's a lead up time right now where members and offices in both the House and the Senate are talking to leadership about what their priorities in the next stimulus package are. And so there's an opportunity, regardless of whether your member of Congress is in leadership, to be able to influence and ensure that your member is talking about workforce and education as a priority in that stimulus package right now, because leadership is listening to the members of their caucus about what they need to include in those negotiations. A few things that I'll flag as potentially being included in the next stimulus package. The first thing I'll say about all of these is that none of these are a foregone conclusion. One of the things that we've heard from conversations is a comparison between what we're likely to see out of stimulus packages coming, both CARES and then looking forward to another stimulus package, and the level of funding that was included under the Recovery Act in 2009, where workforce programs saw about a 40% increase in funding from those current levels. Because workforce has not been a foregone conclusion as far as necessary to include in any sort of COVID response package, I think that we're in the same place where we need continued advocacy, and members need to hear from folks on the call today and otherwise about the importance of workforce being included. So I'll mention a few that we've been hearing from offices there's interest in, but I don't think that we're at the point where we can assume that any of these will necessarily be included without continued and intentional advocacy. So the first is that there's likely to be, there is conversation about investments in Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, career and technical education, and adult education, consistent with the bill Relaunching America's Workforce Act that I mentioned House Dems introduced. There's also a Senate Democrat version of that bill that would include $15 billion of funding for WIOA, career technical education, and adult education. I don't think that we're likely to see anywhere near that level of investment. That the House Dems put $2.25 billion of investment in largely in WIOA formula dollars, and I think that that's optimistically probably the highest that we could expect to see for WIOA. There was no dedicated adult basic education funding in what we saw in HEROES. And so continuing to increase the advocacy around the need for those additional dollars will be critical right now. There's also been conversation about ensuring that there's capacity for community and technical colleges and education providers to partner with industry and other community organizations. Folks may be familiar with the tax grants that were passed as part of the recovery package in 2009. And there's energy around re-upping some investments in those partnerships. The thing that I'll point out that is triggered through some of those conversations is there's largely not been any interest in being able to push forward proposals that would be new funding or new programs under a stimulus package. And so the appeal of re-upping the tax grants is that their members and the authorizing committees are able to point to the success of those grants and the funding that was passed as part of the Recovery Act is the fact that this isn't a new program, even though it would be a line item that has not been funded in recent years. Next, there's proposals from both the House Democrats bill and conversations happening with Senate Democrats around funding for contact tracers and case managers to support people who test positive for COVID and need to quarantine. There's been a push in some of these proposals to include a workforce component and training component as part of those. The HEROES Act included $500 million for a workforce component, and there's several proposals in the Senate. Of the proposals talking about workforce, many raise up the importance of contact tracers and case managers coming from the communities with which they are working and for whom they are serving. And so ensuring that those components continue to be a priority in the conversation is another opportunity for funding that is outside of some of the formula grants that folks may be familiar with. And then the one other thing that I'll mention as far as additional conversations that are happening a little bit outside of the stimulus package in general is that there's House Democrats have pushed forward a set of recommendations a couple of weeks ago around infrastructure. We're likely to see additional proposals come out from them, potentially around apprenticeship and maybe even something on the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Probably not full reauthorizations under those, but we're likely to see additional hearings and conversation happening as they, having moved through their HEROES Act, try and put forward House Democrat priorities looking to, before we get to all the attention focusing on the election, 2020 election. And so while there may not be policy that actually moves as the result of those conversations, it will be an opportunity to be talking to members about the importance of not just moving those policies forward, but in the current both appropriations and stimulus conversations, actually investing in the kind of training that they would be supporting through those reauthorization conversations. So all of that is just to say that whether it's infrastructure, stimulus, or appropriations, there's lots of opportunities right now for members to be hearing from folks. And now is an absolutely critical time to be able to emphasize both what you all are experiencing on the ground and how additional funding can be critical to your work. So I'll turn it back over to Amanda to add some of the more specific components about this process related to immigrant workers.
Thanks, Katie. That was a tremendous amount of information packed into a short period of time, and we appreciate that. I want to just take a step back and remind folks, you know, if the fundamental challenge that a lot of us were wrestling with is how do we pump more money into the organizations that already have known, trusted relationships with immigrant communities, right? We can do that by pumping more money into community colleges. We can do that by pumping more money into nonprofit community-based organizations. In some cases, we can do it by pumping money into labor unions or labor management partnerships. So part of the mechanisms that Katie's just been running through are not just good practices for how do we serve workers who are out of work right now in a crisis and a pandemic, but how do we make sure that money gets down to the ground level to organizations that have trusted relationships with the people who need those services. And that's critically important, and that's why your advocacy is important, because it helps connect the dots between your elected officials and helping them understand, because we know that immigrants are never going to accidentally get served well in any public program. It needs to be intentional, right? There needs to be an intentional focus on, okay, if we're putting out money to address unemployed people, this is how immigrants can be served. If we're putting out money for contact tracers, there needs to be language in there about culturally and linguistically appropriate services, right? Which we did see in that very good bill from Representative Levin and Senator Warren, right? They have very good language in there about that. So part of why your role as immigrant advocates is important is because workforce as a field doesn't typically have deep expertise in immigration issues. And immigration advocacy as a field typically doesn't have super deep roots in workforce. So you all are critically important because you sit at the center of that Venn diagram in the overlap between those two things. So I wanted to mention 3 quick things before I pass it along to Dan to talk about another piece of the policy. The first is I just want to acknowledge that the circumstances facing undocumented immigrant workers are distinct in some respects from the circumstances facing documented workers. There are some services in the workforce system that are open only to people who have work authorization. And so we are mindful of that. And National Skills Coalition's recommendations around funding have been to pump money into both parts of the system. That is, the parts like the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act Title II, which does not have immigration status restrictions, can see immigrants without status, and that's fine, except in 3 states where states have their own state level regulations. The House Democrats bill that passed in May, which is not being taken up by the Senate in its current form, but pieces of it could be, had a significant increase in funding for the Susan Hart. I noticed that a lot of you were put in the text box about worker safety and occupational safety and health. Susan Harwood grants do not have immigration status restrictions. These come from the U.S. Department of Labor, from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. I've just dropped a link into the chat. Many immigrant serving organizations have been funded in the past to provide worker safety training. Sometimes that includes English language learning, sometimes that includes other skills. A lot of their training materials are publicly available on the website, and there is an open round of grant applications happening now through July 20th. So that's just another piece of the puzzle to think about as you're thinking about how do we get support out there to immigrants who may or may not be eligible for different federal funding streams. 2 other developments. Of course, we all know that we're waiting on a Supreme Court ruling in the DACA case. There is a bill that the House passed last year, H.R. 6, the Dream and Promise Act. It's an excellent bill. It includes many recommendations that many groups around today's table worked hard to include. The Senate has not shown any interest in taking that up. However, Senator Durbin and Graham, who have been longtime Dream Act advocates, do have their own Dream bill in the Senate. My guess is that if the Supreme Court rules against Dreamers in their ruling, there will be renewed pressure on Congress to do something. Whether Congress feels the urgency to act is really going to depend on people like us and how much heat we apply. The public charge regulation is in effect now, and we've all seen already the chilling effect that the public charge regulation has caused in scaring immigrant families away from receiving services, even though education and workforce are not included in the services that would count against people in the public charge test. If this is something that's of keen interest to you, we do have some really good 2-page fact sheets on our website, which I'll also drop links in the chat box too. And then finally, I saw that Miriam mentioned this in the chat. The House CARES Act that passed in March included funding for higher education. And originally, the Department of Education said that colleges had flexibility in providing emergency student aid to whoever they thought needed that aid. And then the secretary reversed course and said that actually immigrant students and international students, DACA students rather, and international students and a whole range of other students would not be allowed to get that emergency student aid. There's been a big tug of war over this. California is actually suing the federal government over it. Happy to chat more about that in the Q&A if folks want to delve deeper into that piece. But I want to go ahead and turn things over to Dan here so that I can keep us on track time-wise. And Dan, I know you have a particular piece of policy that you want to lift up. So over to you.
Thank you, Amanda. And while I understand that many of you already work at the intersection of immigrants and the workforce, I'd like to just remind everyone of three things. First of all, immigrants already represent 17%. That's nearly 1/5 of the US workforce, and they will be a growing percentage of the US workforce for decades to come. The second thing is simply this, that immigrants are even more heavily represented in what COVID-19 has highlighted as essential workers. Immigrants, for example, make up 73% of the agriculture sector and 28% of physicians and surgeons and 20% of the transportation industry. And then thirdly, immigrants surpass the native-born population in terms of their entrepreneurial activities, and this is especially true also of refugees, in that they represent large percentages of Main Street businesses, such as 61% of gas stations, 58% of dry cleaner and laundry services, and 53% of grocery stores. So, however, in light of COVID-19, I'd like to draw our attention to the healthcare sector. As I mentioned earlier, immigrants already are heavily represented in the healthcare sector. They are on the front lines in the fight against COVID-19. However, even before COVID-19, the US was facing a healthcare worker shortage that is only going to continue with the aging of the US population and the fact that there simply are not enough native-born workers to fill the demand. So what can be done about the current challenges of COVID-19 and the shortages of healthcare workers? Well, there is currently a bipartisan bill that has been introduced in both the Senate and the House called the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act. The act has broad and growing bipartisan support in both chambers, and it will recapture 40,000 unused employment-based visas and will use them to expedite processing for immigrant doctors and nurses prepared to engage around COVID-19. However, here's an often not understood part of this bill, and that is that these nurses and doctors are already in line for green cards, and some of them are already here in the US under other temporary visas such as H-1B visas or EB-3 visas, but are waiting for green card because of the backlog. This act will not skip over healthcare workers already in the green card backlog and has safeguards not to displace current US healthcare workers. While the act will end 90 days after the COVID-19 national emergency, those who benefit from these visas will be available to help going forward in terms of our need for healthcare workers in the long term. So what am I asking? Simply this, that you engage with your respective representatives and senators to co-sponsor the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act, or thank them if they've already co-sponsored the bill. Our hope is that this bill will be included in the next COVID-19 relief or recovery package. We see this act and others of similar acts as a template for future such bills that would recognize how immigrants can serve as a solution to worker shortages and how education and workforce funding is essential for the full recovery of our economy. Thank you, and I'm going to turn it back to Jackie.
Thanks so much, Dan. Well, keeping with the discussion around the healthcare crisis in the US and the shortages that have only been exacerbated as a result of COVID, I want to talk a little bit about a bill that was introduced in the House of Representatives. It's H.R. 6432. And this bill seeks to establish a task force, a national task force that would be based out of Health and Human Services, or HHS, and it would look at the barriers to employment facing international medical graduates. And I see that some folks in the chat have raised this as one of the issues that their organizations are facing in serving immigrants. So what do we know about the population? According to Migration Policy Institute data that was released in April, approximately 263,000 immigrants and refugees are currently in the United States, but are underemployed or unemployed. And these individuals are folks who have at least a bachelor's degree in a health-related field. Of those, about 165,000 were trained outside the United States. And I think it's worth noting here for just a moment that this is a small segment of a much bigger population. More than 2 million immigrants in the United States are underemployed or unemployed who have skills that were developed, education or training that was developed, that was earned outside the United States. We all know on this call, because we see it every day, the impacts that this has on our communities. So HR 6432 would seek to establish a task force that would look at these barriers in the healthcare sector specifically, and would call on the task force to look at the cost of physician shortages and ways in which international medical graduates can help to fill these shortages. The task force would then be required to issue their findings and recommendations to Congress. And we think that this is an important first step that the federal government can take to address some of the licensing barriers that we know international medical graduates face here in the United States. What we're asking for folks on the call, if this is something that is of interest to you, the bill currently has 9 co-sponsors. We ask that you call your members of Congress, encourage them to co-sponsor the bill. Again, that's HR 6432. And also, if your organization would like to endorse the bill, there is an opportunity for organizations to lend their support to this measure. And so we would encourage folks to please reach out to us. I'm sure our information will be available after the webinar. Reach out. We're happy to give you more information. And if you would like to endorse the bill, we can make sure to facilitate that. So that is it for me. And I think I'm passing it back over to Jessica.
Yep. Thank you.
Excellent.
Hi, everyone. So there was a lot of bills thrown around and things like that. I know that some people have asked for repeats of the numbers on the chat. Thank you, Carletti, for doing that. So before I get into the action component, I wanted to propose one more question for the chat. I'm submitting it now, which is, what immigrant education or workforce issues should Congress be responding to in future legislation? We already threw out some things just now, and also with the actions that I'm about to propose, feel free to weave in any of the endorsements that we just received from the Immigration Forum and Wes. So the first resource I'm gonna give you, if you didn't already have it, which is great, I'm putting this in the chat now. This link brings you to all of the Twitter handles for both the House and the Senate for you to find them. We found that, not only do all of your representatives have a Twitter, but they do follow it closely. They are looking at it. And so we really want to empower you to tweet as much as you can. I would ask you to do it now. You can fold in any of the things that we just talked about. We also have a sample tweet here. Let me see. So I'm going to share my screen to show you a sample tweet. Ooh, hold on. Okay. So when it says @ your senator, that would be your senator's Twitter handle. We're using the hashtag skills to recover right now. But anything else, this is just a suggestion, like I said, but it's a sort of sample template. And that way we can sort of follow the progress and see what representatives are receiving what. I would advise focusing on the Senate right now in terms of where the power is. So if you only do one thing today, I think it would be targeted towards your senators. So I'm going to just give everyone a second to do that and encourage you to actually do it in the moment if you've got your phone available. Okay. And then I can also put that in the chat in terms of the actual language so you all have it. But the second part of this, I'm going to put this in the chat now. If you follow this link, it's a plug and play for sending an email to your members of Congress. And this is generally about funding, including funding for immigrants in terms of workforce. Let me see. Now I don't know where my chat is. So that link will take you to, and you just put in your address and your phone number, or your address and your name, and then it can go directly to all of your members if you like. And I'm sure lots of you have questions about the information that was just covered, or just general questions about the Hill. And so we made a point to invest, at least 20 minutes. It looks like we're gonna have a little bit more than that actually, for just a pure Q&A conversation. You'll have access to Katie Spiker, Amanda, Jackie, Dan. So go ahead, and in addition to the questions, in addition to the answer of the question that I just put in, any additional questions you have, just put that into the chat, and we can try to answer as many as we can.
All right, thanks to all of you who've already taken action. Thanks to all of you who will take action. If you are working for an organization or you're in a position where you're not able to directly contact your senator yourself, I hope you'll share information about advocacy opportunities with others in your network who might be able to take action. And we will certainly share language with you. So I'm seeing a comment from Liz Iannotti in the chat about Congress should be including better support for language training and seeing people's primary languages as a strength rather than a deficit. And I'm going to say that educators are out in front of policymakers on this issue. I'm not saying that every educator has solved it, but definitely the conversation I'm seeing among people who specialize in bilingual education, dual language, immersion, whatever you want to call it, there's a growing recognition of the value of people's primary language, and policymakers aren't there yet. We've seen a little bit shifting because of the census, and people are suddenly realizing that people's primary language spoken has value in the labor market. And our good friends at the New American Economy, who are on today's webinar, have released some really excellent reports on the demand for bilingual workers. But I think much more needs to be done to educate policymakers about why bilingual skills are valuable and people's primary language skills are valuable. And I encourage folks to do that as part of their workforce advocacy. Okay. So other questions, comments? I'm seeing some things come in the chat. If folks have things that you'd like to share that your organization has been advocating on at the federal level, or things you're concerned about that you've been hearing about at the federal level, this would be a great time to name those, even if you don't have a specific question formulated around them. That would be great. I do also want to take this moment to just say, Jackie, a lot of the folks on this call sort of go back and forth between state and local level work and federal level work. Is there anything you want to share from your lens at WEF about how you think of federal work as kind of supporting the state and local work that folks are engaged in, and building those connections?
Yeah, that's a great question, Amanda. And I think the task force that we mentioned is a great example of how federal policymakers can support policies that promote employment among immigrants and refugees, when typically those are state policy issues. And so what does that mean? As we know, for example, occupational licensing is a state by state policy. The states are responsible for determining largely who is eligible for an occupational license. So there's not that much that the federal government can do with respect to licensing reform. But one of the things that they can do is establish a task force or establish a study looking at some of those barriers so that they can drive a national conversation and show leadership at the national level in order to support states, so that the states both have the information that they need and they sort of have the political cover they may need if they want to then act in their state to change licensing laws. So it's really a matter, and at least with occupational licensure, it's really a matter of leadership at the federal level rather than policy change that can actually get people licensed, if that makes sense.
That's great. I've also seen questions in the chat about online education, and I want to flag for folks, there's kind of two angles to think about this. One is, are people getting the access they need to be able to participate in the education and training programs they want to participate in remotely? In other words, do people have broadband internet access? Do they have up-to-date digital devices? Do they have the digital literacy skills they need? And National Skills Coalition has actually just released a couple of materials on digital literacy that kind of talk about this. And there is legislation in Congress that would tackle this challenge. Senator Murray in Washington State has introduced a bill called the Digital Equity Act, which would very explicitly require states to develop digital inclusion plans that are inclusive of the full diversity of their state residents, including immigrants and English language learners. And then the states would be eligible for federal funding. So if you are somebody who has seen how this pandemic has really heightened the gaps in access that many immigrants face, that's one way you can frame your conversation with Congress about how important it is that there be greater investment in digital inclusion generally and digital literacy more particularly. But there's also some, I think, room for greater investment in the professional development and the program development of providing high quality online training. A lot of you know there's a big difference between emergency remote teaching and high quality online learning. Emergency remote teaching is what some really good-humored, good-intentioned people tried to do quickly after the pandemic. And some of you may have K-12 age children at home. Some of you may have been enrolled yourself in post-secondary courses. And there was a huge scramble for people to say, gosh, how do I quickly take my in-person class that I planned so much for and move it online? But that is not the same as building from the ground up a high-quality online learning experience. And that's particularly not the same in terms of building a high-quality online learning experience for people who don't speak English as their primary language. And if that's an issue that you care about, then I encourage you, as you're reaching out to Congress, to talk about the importance of investing in higher education institutions and community-based nonprofit organizations to be able to actually have the staff time they need to develop that curriculum, to develop those programs, because you can't do it just by saying, oh, I had an in-person class and now I'm going to wave a magic wand and it's an online class. We've all seen what that looks like, and while well-intentioned, it is definitely not high-quality online learning. Okay, so I see more questions coming in, which is great. So folks should please go ahead and continue adding to the chat. And thanks, Jackie, for sharing the information on HR 6432 that Wes is focused on. There was a question about the Digital Equity Act, and that's Senator Murray in Washington State who's been the lead on the Digital Equity Act. If folks want to dig deeper on that, we're also happy to share in a follow-up email some additional information about the Digital Equity Act and digital equity issues generally. Dan, I'd like to come to you. National Immigration Forum, in addition to doing a lot of Hill advocacy, of course, you do have partners at the forum who are working on the ground, including through your New American Workforce program to provide English language training to immigrant grocery store workers and others. Is there anything you'd like to share from that work that kind of could inform this conversation about federal investments in immigrant workforce and adult education?
Sure. And thanks for that opportunity. I'd like to speak a little bit about the work that's being done by our integration team in the area of what we are calling contextualized English language learning, that is contextualized to a particular sector of the economy. So one of the areas where we began this work in was in the retail sector, in particular in the grocery sector. We work specifically with businesses that want to increase the English language learning abilities of their employees. And what we found when COVID-19 happened was we were already engaged in training, but it was what we would call a blended method, basically some online training and then in-person training. And we had to basically adapt our program and our curriculum to go to full online training. And we have graduated a class from that period, and it was highly successful. The retention rate of those who remained in the course, even though it had to go to full online learning, was significant. And they were also grateful for the fact that we continued and found ways to do it all online as opposed to having some in-person training. And so what we learned from that is how we're going to go forward, at least in the present environment. And more businesses are engaging with us in different sectors. And we're producing our own specialized curriculum for those particular sectors so that the English they're learning is tailored to the work they're doing and the language often associated with that particular work.
Great. Thanks, Dan. That's really helpful context for folks to have. I want to go back to two issues that I saw raised quite a bit at the beginning of today's conversation. I noticed that a number of you talked about challenges in helping immigrants access the unemployment insurance system, both around language access and sort of multilingual capacity and more helping them navigate it. And then I saw several comments on occupational safety and health, particularly for essential workers in meatpacking plants and in other really kind of high-risk situations like nursing homes. I'm curious to know, for those of you who didn't mention those issues already, are these things that have been salient for you in your part of the country? And if the answer is yes, if you could just put that in the chat box and put the name of your state or your city in parentheses, that would be really helpful data for us to have so we can understand better how these issues are playing out at the state and local level. So again, issues around accessing unemployment insurance for immigrants, and if you can mention that, or issues around occupational safety and health. So it looks like this is a very widespread set of issues because I'm getting shout outs from all over the place here. And that's helpful data to have, even though I know it's a very frustrating and difficult situation that many folks are facing with the immigrants that they're working with. Katie, can I come back to you for a second? You know, pre-pandemic, a lot of the folks on this call had been interested in work on apprenticeship. The concept of apprenticeship is this idea that you earn while you learn. Our former labor secretary used to call it the other college without the debt. And it's a way for people who can't afford to quit their job while they go back to school to actually get training in a job and get paid at the same time. Can you talk a little bit about how has the landscape for apprenticeship changed since COVID? And what do you see as kind of the next steps in the apprenticeship conversation? Because I know that was a topic where, particularly in Baltimore and in Boise, there has been quite a bit of work by immigrant advocates to get on-ramps for immigrants into the apprenticeship system.
That's a good question, Amanda. The thing, and you mentioned this in your question, apprenticeship prior to the pandemic was getting a lot of attention and bipartisan attention. For the past few years, we've seen increased investments in apprenticeships funding from through the appropriations process. The Department of Labor has funded contracts and put significant amount of funding out to states and given states a lot of flexibility about how they're spending these dollars to expand apprenticeship to workers. Since the pandemic, a lot of Congress's attention has been pulled away from the apprenticeship conversation, although I do think that the House Democrats are likely to continue some of their conversation around apprenticeship. And I mentioned this in my opening comments, as they set down a set of marker policies prior to the election. But I think, you know, one of the big things that we've seen and heard from our partners across the country is that a lot of the apprenticeship programs have had to either be retooled or come to a stop because workers are no longer at the work site, or the work site is being transitioned, if it's a manufacturing location, into something that's responding more to the crisis. And so we've seen kind of a pause on a lot of the momentum around apprenticeship. I think that's likely to continue, especially given the focus that we'll have, given the economic crisis in coming months, on helping people get back into jobs. But I do think that building on that momentum and having a conversation as we look forward to how we're not just or helping people get back into the workforce, but particularly for workers who are most at risk of losing their jobs, the apprenticeship conversation to really focus on upskilling and work opportunities that may not rise to a registered apprenticeship program, which is that other 4-year degree that you mentioned, Amanda. And using this as an opportunity to expand the conversation to other ways that businesses can be supporting workers upskilling and reskilling right now while keeping those workers on the job.
Great, that's really helpful. So I've seen a lot of comments in the chat today and certainly been hearing a lot from folks around the country about the fact that immigrants are disproportionately represented in a lot of industries that are probably going to be slow to come back during the recovery. So restaurant jobs, hotel jobs. I know most of us probably had conferences we were supposed to attend later this year or early next year that have already been canceled or transitioned to a virtual format. So we're all really aware of the ways in which those jobs may come back slowly, if they come back at all. So when we think about the sectors that are growing and expanding right now, certainly transportation, distribution, and logistics is an area. Some parts of the healthcare, industry, we've talked about contact tracing. Are there things that you would want folks to be aware of around the infrastructure piece, right? We often think about infrastructure as kind of building roads and bridges and jobs that have traditionally gone disproportionately to white, native-born male workers. What should immigrant advocates be thinking about, Katie, when it comes to infrastructure and when it comes to making sure that immigrants have equitable access to infrastructure jobs at a time when they may not be able to go back to their restaurant or their hotel jobs anytime soon?
I think making that connection for members of Congress is really important right now. So House Democrats released a surface transportation bill that would fund a lot of the traditional infrastructure pieces, the roads and bridges, a couple weeks ago. There's been a push from leadership to include both in the House and then from the White House, there's now conversations that they're putting together an infrastructure proposal that they should release soon. That would include things like broadband. On the House Dem side, they've been thinking about some of the green infrastructure pieces. I think the critical component, regardless of what kind of infrastructure we're talking about, is recognizing that if we do make significant investments in these kind of projects, that there need to be workers to fill those jobs. And those workers, particularly now, are going to need training in order to do so. And I think that just because of the way that Congress works in the jurisdiction of different committees, it's often an afterthought to weave in some of that education and training component into a bill that may otherwise be focused on something like infrastructure. And so raising for your members the fact that the folks that you all are working with would need education and skills in order to fill some of those jobs, and have the opportunity now to do so, I think that that's really important to raise up as part of the infrastructure conversation. And something that's getting marginal attention right now. It's certainly part of the conversation, but it has not been integrated in either what we've seen the Senate or the House push forward.
That's great. Thanks, Katie. I do also want to acknowledge that while the mainstream press often talks about immigration as an urban issue, folks on today's call know that rural communities have significant immigrant populations. And Katie, I know, one of the things when we think about congressional targets is we think about which congresspeople or which senators chair the important committees that are kind of like the bottlenecks for whether legislation is going to survive or whether it's going to die in committee. Are there particular states or particular congressional districts that you want to call out now that folks should really be thinking about whether they live there or not, in terms of who do I know that is in that district or is in that state and could reach out to that policymaker and really connect the dots for them that rural issues, for example, really are immigrant workforce issues, or that, workforce in general is something they need to be paying closer attention to? Who should we be thinking about as those targets?
I think Amanda or Jessica, one of you put this in the chat box earlier, so folks may have already seen. A lot of the focus right now from our conversation has been on senators because the House Dems and House Democrats leadership has put their marker out as what they want in a next stimulus package through the HEROES Act. So I would point folks towards appropriators on the Senate side as a key place to focus right now. Those are the members that are going to be that have the purse strings and are going to be tasked with figuring out where the money goes, both through our annual appropriations process and through stimulus dollars that may come out through another bill. So that would be Senator Murray in Washington State, Senator Blunt in Missouri. Those are some of the folks who are really controlling that conversation. Again, Senator Murray is also the ranking member on the authorizing committee that has jurisdiction over the education and workforce programs. So she holds a lot of responsibility there, as well as Senator Alexander in Tennessee. On the House side, a lot of the conversation is happening at the leadership level still. And so folks in California connecting with Speaker Pelosi and ensuring that the leadership over there hears that workforce and education issues and immigrant worker issues were not included at adequate levels in HEROES Act. And so addressing some of the concerns that looking forward, there needs to be a better inclusion of those issues in additional packages.
Yeah, I just want to go back to something Dan said, that immigrants are 17% of the U.S. workforce, and yet we repeatedly see when we talk to policymakers on Capitol Hill that they think of immigration as a status issue. They say, oh, that's for the Judiciary Committee to worry about, and that's about visas. And it's like, well, that's a really important piece of the conversation, but it's definitely not all of it. And so a really important sort of task for all of you in your communications with legislators is to remind them that immigrants are present as long-term and permanent members of their communities and constituents. And this isn't just about whether people have status or not, as important as that question is.
Amanda,
so I want to give Dan and Jackie, 1 minute each to wrap up here before we close out. So Dan, over to you.
Thank you. I just wanted to add, in light of the fact that we're seeing the administration begin to weigh in on what they may like to see in the next package, and it looks like they're talking about infrastructure and transportation. I think we need, as a community, I think we need to be really creative and start looking back at some bills perhaps that we've already attempted to push forward. I'm thinking, for example, like the Gateway to Careers Act, the PATH Act. I'm thinking also of the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. And are there pieces in those acts that we can pull over into the next package that would address some of the immigrant workforce issues? And I think the answer is there absolutely are. Perhaps we can't get the whole bill, but can we get pieces of some of these bills in there? And also, can we get pieces in there that look at the education and workforce development needs of the immigrant community? I think there was a question that was raised about infrastructure. One of the big issues there is, of course, construction, and that's another area where immigrants are already heavily represented. So I think there's a lot that could be done, and the longer this takes, it gives us a little bit more time to figure out ways to do just that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Jackie, any closing thoughts?
I just want to encourage everyone on the call to be getting in touch with your members of Congress, get in touch with your senators. Even if you think that there's no chance they'll support what you're asking, it is so critical that they hear from you. It's more critical that they hear from you. And even if you think they are supportive, call them, say thank you. We know that members of Congress track the phone calls. It's super important. Phone calls are better than email if you can do it. And also, tweeting at them, that helps too. Anything to make your voices heard, particularly in these next couple of weeks while we think we have some time to advocate for workforce dollars for our communities.
That's a great reminder, Jackie. And I'll just add one thing to that, which is even if you think your member of Congress might not listen to you, they have staff, and that staff is the person you're talking to. And those staff members often go on to take other jobs on the Hill, and educating them about your issues is never a waste of time, because they're going to learn from you, they're going to remember your stories, and they're going to take that with them into the next phase of their work. Thank you all so much for making the time to join us today in the middle of what I know is a very tumultuous time for so many of us. We really appreciate it. We will follow up with you later this week with the resource items that a lot of folks requested in chat and the additional follow-up resources that we promised. In the meantime, have a great rest of your afternoon.